Are you an HVAC professional looking to set your business apart? Then the Leading HVAC podcast is your go-to resource. I'm Kimon Hines, coach and trainer at SBE. And in this podcast, we'll share stories of success and struggle from leaders in the HVAC industry. You'll hear from experienced executives, managers, and innovators, providing you with the hard-earned insights from their journeys. These insights will equip you with the knowledge you need to navigate challenges and truly lead in the ever-evolving HVAC world. Welcome to the Leading HVAC podcast. I'm your host, Kimon Hines. I'm super excited today that I have another amazing guest. Before I introduce her, I'm going to remind you again, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're watching or listening to this to. And I have a challenge for you. At the end, if you receive value, share this episode with someone else. Today, my guest is Ann Lowe. Ann is the VP for Field Operations and Administration for George Brazil, based in the Phoenix, Arizona area. Ann, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
I'm excited about this discussion. We have been on numerous calls together, but this time we have a chance to hear more about your story, your insights on leadership. And so I'm excited to jump into it.
Thank you. Me too.
Well, Ann, tell us about this. Why did you get into the HVAC business and how long have you been in it?
Sure. Well, it was completely by accident. And it was 14 years ago that I first started here at George Brazil.
14 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Tell us when that accident, what does that mean when you say by accident?
So I was literally just looking for a full-time job. Had just had my own business and was ready for a change and really not looking for any leadership role whatsoever. I had had plenty of those in the past, and I was just looking for a change and just an opportunity to get out of the house and do something full-time while my daughter started college. So I came in I'd met Jim through a church job that I had as a bookkeeper at a church. He was on the finance council and just kind of, chatted and decided to take an interview at George Brazil. My only criteria was I was looking for a company that was built on honesty and integrity. And really that was my main goal there. And he brought me in as an accounting clerk. And I was perfectly fine with that initially. Started doing accounting, balancing, reconciling accounts. And it wasn't long before Jim, Corey, and Heather approached me and said, "Hey, would you like to manage the customer service department?" At which I said, "No, thank you." And it wasn't long before I was in charge of customer service and dispatch. Actually, customer service, then dispatch. And then before then, I was involved in the service department, kind of attending meetings, and ended up acquiring the service department.
Wow.
Should I go on?
Yeah, I mean, and it sounds like the theme is they just kept adding more and more responsibilities to you.
They did. And then I at one point said, "No way am I going to be in charge of the sales department." And then I was in charge of the sales department. So, and then essentially it became, Heather and I kind of co-managed the field as Dave started to, branch out to create and found SBE. That's when I ended up being in charge of the entire field as well.
Wow.
So
okay. Now, as you're sharing this, one thing you did not say, you were never a technician, so you didn't do that side of it. Now, for someone who is watching this podcast, listening to this, as you're sharing all of these roles that you've taken on, was there any sort of any challenges with the fact that you didn't know that side of the business, and how did you navigate learning new roles in the new roles?
Sure. My main philosophy there is I don't need to reinvent a wheel, and I'm attracted to people who have been successful in that role that I am now acquiring. So for example, with customer service dispatch, I had never been a CSR dispatcher.
Wow.
I'd never been in previous lives ever done any of that work whatsoever. So my only request was I wanted to learn from somebody who was good at it already. So in that particular case, our answering service at the time was called Answer One, had numerous awards for what they do, for customer service, for their skill set, for all of that. So I said, I want to go visit them. I want to learn from them. So that's what I did. I went and had multiple tours to see what it was they did that made them so successful. So I learned from them. I incorporated things they did. I even hired them to help do extra work for us, short of just answering for us, in the off times. The same thing with the field. I obviously have never been in the field, but I know enough to know what success looks like. And my main philosophy with the field, because I've never been a technician, is I'm not going to make decisions for them. I want to learn from them. So when we do look at changes, that's why we incorporated our advisory board, which includes our service technicians, or a group of them that were nominated, because we're not going to pretend to know everything that they encounter out there. And I'd rather learn from them and get their feedback. We're still going to make the right decisions for the business. So, but I want to know what matters to them and what these decisions we make, how they affect them without making that decision.
That's good.
So that way their perspective is understood and is in part of the decision making.
That's really good. And you brought up the advisory board.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a few questions on that. So tell us, how many employees does George Brazil have now? And at what stage did you implement that board?
Sure.
And how does that function? How does that work?
Sure. Yeah, but really it's just pertains to the service / maintenance department in general. But I mean, as far as company wide, we have, I think at this point, we're about 230-40 employees total. Our service department is around 50 to 60, depending on the season, of course. And I think even at, call it 30 in our service department, might have been about where we were when we started the advisory board. And the importance of it there was we wanted to be able to, again, get their perspective, but then we also wanted a mechanism in which to share that information to the others, or essentially, let's just say, get feedback from the others. So we basically said to all of them, I sent an email and said, hey, I have 2 questions. We want to create an advisory board. So I need to know, A, are you interested in being a part of it? And B, who would you elect to represent you? So we wanted those people who the others respected, and essentially took all that information down, and that gave us our leaders. So we had, I believe we have 7 current service technicians that were either nominated or essentially had the highest number of nominations from their peers. And I honestly think it's been the best thing we've done. Now, clearly with smaller companies, it's a smaller sampling of people, but the best part of it, in my opinion, what I saw the difference there is that when we did make changes, implemented new things, there wasn't the resistance that we used to have, because they felt like they were being represented, and that whatever feelings they might have, very likely their peers have. So those people they kind of elected to represent them were sharing their concerns or their opinions or whatnot. So it wasn't as difficult to implement something because they felt heard. Yeah. And so they felt like when we did make the decision, it was a well-rounded, well thought out, their concerns or challenges or opinions were being heard and were part of that decision-making process.
That makes so much sense. And I can see how valuable, how important that is for your company as it gets bigger. I wonder, for smaller companies, someone might be listening to this and they have a very small company. Maybe they have 5 techs or less. What is how can you apply that principle to a smaller company?
Sure. Again, I think it's just mainly, I mean, if you have a super small company, though the entire group could be part of it. I think the main message there is we're asking them for feedback. At the end of the day, they have to respect us enough as leaders to know that we're still going to make a decision. And our main criteria that we've told them, that our filter, let's call it, that we make every decision from, it has to be good for the customer, good for the employees as a whole, and good for the company. It's not just about the service department employees, but all of our employees. So if you run things through that filter, of course, a lot of feedback is going to be what makes sense to a service technician, but it has to be for all 3 of those components. So you could certainly do it with a small group. And again, if it's say 5 service techs, they could all be part of this, but it has to be made clear that again, it's feedback.
Yeah.
Management team has to be the ones that make the final decision going through that filter. So the mistake is that you could make would be for those people to think that they're making the decisions for the business.
Yeah.
Instead
That
of
makes
just providing feedback.
That's a great point. That's a great
Yeah.
point. Now, and that was very valuable right there. As you've talked about your journey, what I've heard is you've picked up other responsibilities. And I'm sure that you've had to release responsibilities as you've maybe transitioned to a different role. And maybe sometimes what I see as a challenge for some of us in leadership is that being able to pass something else off. And I'm no longer in charge of this. How have you managed to navigate some of those transitions? And if you have an example of how you've done it, how can you share
Sure.
that with us?
Well, I think one thing that I did learn, as you kind of in the beginning talked about, was I definitely like to make sure things are done and done right, especially if I'm responsible. So delegating was not my strong suit initially. And
Mhm.
what I had to learn was I had to always be looking for those new leaders or the next leaders, people who I could delegate to that I could then feel good about saying, okay, now you own this piece. It took me a little while to learn that. And I think the best thing that I learned from that was I would take people who I thought looked like they had some good leadership skills, and I would just dabble with giving them some responsibility. I didn't change their titles, I didn't change their comps. I just tested to see if my instincts were right. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes people who I thought might do really well and be kind of maybe be able to be elevated to a lead or to a supervisor or whatnot. They didn't necessarily possess the things that I thought they did, by way of ownership, taking those responsibilities, seeing it through, being creative, coming up with new ways to do things and really, being able to see what their skill sets were. I did that by dabbling. Again, to promote and go too far too fast, you can't back that up without potentially losing people. So I learned the hard way that it's much better to test the waters, test people, give
Mhm.
them those tasks, and then monitor it and see, how they do with it. And then you can mentor. And of course, you can always mentor people into roles, but
Mhm.
sometimes people just aren't cut out for roles you might think.
Yeah,
And I didn't want to lose good people over not knowing for sure.
absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to handle delegation and to really almost see who is ready for a particular responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I also learned too through that, as you were saying, it's a big organization here. Um, I was very impressed by certain people who I didn't even have to delegate to. They actually just they almost took their roles, by just jumping in and doing it. So there was a few key people here that blew my mind and were so impressive in that they literally assumed the next role without even being asked to do it. And so some of those people will just come out and shine,
Yeah.
whether you know how much potential they have or not. They just essentially take that, which was really neat to see too.
Yeah, that's the best.
It
Um,
really is.
yeah. So, and the word change comes to mind because I can imagine in your 14 years in this industry, you've seen a lot of change
Mhm.
and you've helped George Brazil to navigate a lot of changes. I get the sense from our calls that we're on that that's probably one of the main things that you have responsibility for in terms of navigating it. Talk to us about maybe some of the big changes you've seen and the keys to navigate those changes.
Mhm. Well, going back to the beginning, our biggest change, which is really ironic because it's how SVE came to be, was when we shifted from really having a very large sales department. I think there were 16, 17 salesmen when I first started here in 2010. And by 2012, there were 6,
Wow.
maybe 5. And that shift took place in which we started training our service technicians to sell and recognize the opportunity there. So I think what I have learned over the years of watching all of this take place and change is the one thing that will always
Constant.
be consistent.
Yeah.
If you're not changing, you're not growing. So I think it's really making sure that if you're going to change something, and usually there are fairly significant changes within the organization, not necessarily your culture, but how you're going to do things. It's having those people that are going to own those changes and see it through to the end. And for me, I feel like that's administratively, that's the biggest component of any organization is having strong administration. Whether it was me or, some people that I had then delegated that administration to. But the minute you take your foot off the pedal and you don't own whatever that is, whatever initiative that you're trying to drive, it just falls by the wayside. And we were very specific and deliberate in some of the changes that we would make. And I think that's kind of where I ended up in my role was I had that task and I wasn't going to stop until somebody said we need to stop. And having that driver is really important, that administrator that will keep that ball in motion.
Yeah.
So easy to throw out great ideas and great changes and then nobody, pays attention to it when a new shiny object comes into the picture. So it's really having that focus and the ownership of whatever that change is to drive it.
Yeah. Our guest today is Ann Lowe, Vice President of George Brazil. And what does a typical day look like for you in this role, in a big company, growing company? What does a typical day look like for you?
Sure. Well, I would say meetings are probably one of the most time sensitive things that I deal with. We do have, which I absolutely love, we have a couple daily meetings that I think has been a game changer for us that I attend. So we have two very important daily meetings. We have one that's an operational one where it's all of our field managers, as well as the key people in their supporting departments that meet every single morning to discuss what happened yesterday, what were maybe the shortcomings that we need to make sure that we take care of our customers and follow up today. It's keeping all of the people kind of in line of, what do we foresee as challenges for the day? And ultimately, the whole principle is to make sure we're taking care of our customers. So that's a very important daily meeting that we have as well. On the flip side, that's the operational side. On the flip side, it's our sales KPI meeting that we have every morning. Almost the same people, same players in that meeting, but we're discussing what happened yesterday, what were the good things, what are we focused on today, how many appointments do we need to keep the guys busy, and that sort of thing. So those key people, again, are on that meeting to discuss, what do we need to focus on today and where are we kind of a thing. So those are really important daily meetings that we have that I think everybody looks forward to because it keeps the team on the same focus. And again, making sure that our customers are taken care of in the process. And then, it really depends on the time of year, the initiatives, lots and lots of meetings in Jim's office, budgets, what the next new challenge we're facing, with all of the new industry changes. It really depends on the time of year, but lots and lots and lots of meetings. We are constantly looking forward to see what's coming at us and trying to prepare behind the scenes before we roll things out.
Yeah.
We've got price increases, we've got lots of different things that take a lot of time and preparation for.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to underscore, can't share this enough. If you are wanting to lead well in this industry, you have to meet with your team and communicate. Yes. Make sure you're looking at the data. You cannot communicate and then people don't know what's going on for lengths of time. As I'm listening to you, it sounds like you're going from meeting to meeting, but it's impactful and it's meaningful in the meetings.
Yes, it's a lot of collaboration, but it also provides that teamwork, right? When you, like you said, when you communicate, then it's not a mystery what our challenges are or what we need to be working on. And the people who are responsible for those departments and those successes, they need to be a part of that and feel like they have the ability to be a part of it and to be able to, help with that change, whether it's coaching somebody or a lot of times we forget when we look at our numbers and we look at we don't just look at the numbers, we look at the people who are the ones actually doing the work to support those numbers, meaning the field guys. And when we look at that, it's more than just, oh, why is this guy's numbers, he's not doing very well right now. And I know I've mentioned this to you in previous meetings, there's always an underlying need, a reason for it. And most oftentimes it has nothing to do with work. It has to do with challenges in their personal lives. So part of what we want to do too is give our leaders that information so they don't lose sight of the people.
Yeah.
The people are people and they have lives. And we have to make sure that we're, reaching out to them, communicating with them, supporting them. Everybody's going to have a challenge in their personal life at some point, and we're not going to not be there for them. In those moments, they've had lots of successes, but when they're struggling, it just means we have to be there that much more for them.
That's so good. And I know there's a document and something we share with our SBE contractors is that goal setting. And I think that's what you're alluding to as well, that you want to make sure with your team members, you're not just looking at their results and the output, right, but you want to know the personal goals, what is important to them.
Yes. Yeah. When we had made that change on those goals, that was one of the things as I was getting ready to prepare for another goal setting. And I just kept thinking it just feels so impersonal. And as a leader and as a management team, if somebody is struggling, I don't want to tie it to numbers. I want to tie it to numbers that correlate with their personal goals. We do take the time here to really get to know the people. To me, they're not employees, they're people.
Yeah.
And I love nothing more than to understand their family, what makes them tick, what challenges do they have within their personal lives, that we can just be there to support them. And I think that's very important when we stop and really get to know them as people and understand their challenges as people. It really changes things. It really makes them more committed, more loyal, because they know that we're going to do the same for them.
Yeah.
So, like I said, when things are going great, sure, it's easy to have fun and share those successes. But when people are struggling personally, it's important for us to be there for them at that time too.
Absolutely. And this is so much. I feel like I can sneak in one more question before our rapid fire questions. What's one challenge or obstacle that you can share with us from your history, George Brazil, and how you navigated it? Because that's what we want to know. How can we navigate those obstacles?
One challenge.
Just one. Just one.
Yep. I would say today's world has kind of changed a lot, in my opinion, over the last, call it, 3, 4, 5 years. And I think just differentiating ourselves, to get those good employees who are going to be loyal and committed. It seems very hard sometimes to find those people that want to come to work and work hard. So it's really been, us having good interviews, providing the training that we can to hire people who might not come in with all the skill sets, but we can develop them. I think having our training facility has been huge for us because that was a big pain point for us. We were always living in that world of fear that if somebody good left, how do we find another guy at the same caliber versus being able to create people, that skill.
That's a good point. That's great. That's great. All right. And this has been so good. I feel like we need to do another one of these because there's so much I wanted to ask you and just so many practical steps that you share with our listeners and our viewers that they could put into practice, from getting feedback to looking at how do you delegate, just so much. So this is definitely one that you want to share. But Ann, I want to ask you some rapid fire questions before we get out of here. These are questions you answer in 30 seconds or less. So you let me know when you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. What's the best business book that you've read?
I would say The Ideal Team Player.
Okay. All right. All right. Check that out. What about this? What's one thing you want to be better at as a leader in the next year?
Really, I would say it would be more leadership training, taking the time to really develop call it one downs, the second generation.
Yeah, that's good. I can definitely tell that developing leaders is something that you're passionate about.
Yes, very much so. It's super important.
Absolutely. Okay, here's another one. What do you do to de-stress and to enjoy life?
Ooh, well, not as much as I should lately. My probably bigger passion with doing that would be working out. Hasn't been a lot of that lately, but my other thing that I enjoy doing to relax is going out in nature. We have a side by side, so we go out and just ride and
Nice.
recharge the battery that way.
Awesome. Awesome. And that's great.
Mhm.
All right, here's our last question. I'll get you out on this one. If you could go back in time, and I'll let you go back if you want to go back 14 years or even less, what's one piece of advice you would give to yourself when you first became a leader?
I would say trusting yourself, trusting your instincts. I think I've always been too hard on myself, so I didn't realize what I was capable of because of my perfectionist, attitude at times. So I think just being okay with making mistakes, being okay with living in gray. I was in a black and white world for a long time with being in the accounting world, and I think gray is actually where it's at.
I love it. Ann Lowe has been our guest. And thank you so much for being on this episode of the Leading HVAC podcast. Those of you who are watching, viewing this, please take these principles and apply it to your leadership. Thank you for listening to the Leading HVAC podcast. If you would like to learn more about SBE, you can find us online at sbeodyssey.com. That's sbeodyssey.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would appreciate it if you would leave us a review on this podcasting platform. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.